Hey, this is Trissa from Sewing and Things, and in this video I'm going to show you how to hem your Constance using a cover stitch machine. I'm going to hem and top stitch this shirt with my cover stitch machine. And so the thing that I do to get started is I always like to flip my shirt inside out. I feel like it makes it a little bit easier. Go ahead and cut off your tails. If you haven't done so already. So I always like to start at one of the seams when I start hemming a regular hem. And so most patterns will have a hem allowance. And so there are some gauges, some hem gauges that help you determine how wide your hem is. It lets you fold it over and then measures it really easily for you. Mine is broken and I usually just eyeball all my hems anyway because I'm lazy like that. But so I always like to start off by doing one side. Putting a pin or a clip in there, and then I do the other side. And before I get started, since I'm not using a hem gauge, I'm just going to make sure that they are the same. And so they are, so we're going to start with that. So I just start at one side and just fold it over and then just add pins, making sure it is straight. So if you pin your hem crooked, then it's more likely to be crooked afterwards. If you have, depending on your fabric, you can press your hem allowance down to get a nice fold crease, but some knit fabric does not press well. And so I usually just don't even bother getting on my iron and I just pin it instead. Now, if you have a hem gauge, this isn't necessary, but once both sides are pinned, I just grab in a few places and then just double check that I have the same hem allowance. So this one's a little bit skinnier. Then I just take off some pins and just lengthen it just a hair so it's the same. I think this one's a little short too. Yeah, that's a lot better. Yeah. So once that is all pinned, we are ready to go over to our cover stitch and start hemming. This is my Brother Coverstitch 2340 CV. I've had this machine for roughly 5 years and it has done very well for me. And so no complaints. One day I will probably upgrade with all the knit sewing that I do. But this has been pretty good for me for the most part. So once your machine is all threaded, these little markings right here are gauges for you where you can line up your fabric to ensure that your hem is going to be straight. If you start off on this line and then bump up to this line, your hemline obviously is not going to be straight. And so these are really helpful to use to, even if you're not lining up your fabric on a specific line, but maybe in between a line, those are nice to help keep it consistent. And you can also get washi tape or masking tape and put that down. That way you have something, another line to gauge for your hemming. Also, I like to use a narrow stitch for all my hems. I don't love the look of the wide, and so I always do use the middle and the right needle. I know a handful of people like to use that left side, but I started to, but I don't know, I like the other, probably because my hems are smaller. I'm not sure, but I just prefer the right side, the right and the left side. And I usually keep my settings roughly around 4. I've been kind of playing with my needle stitches. Sometimes I feel like those have been a little loose at times, but for the most part, I keep them at 4. And up, the number is tighter. Down, the number is looser. So up tight is what I always like to remember for tension. Same thing goes with your serger. And then if you turn it over here, this is the how we change our stitch length is this little dial here, and then our differential is this one. So if you have wavy fabric, or if it's getting really wavy while you're sewing, you want to bump up your differential to help push your fabric through quicker. Rather than this one, it's stretching it. And so if it is getting wavy, you want to move this knob 1 or 2 times, or however much, to get it to not be wavy. Typically for my regular hems, I keep my stitch at, I think this is at 3 or just 1 click, which looks to be about in between 3 and 4 for my hems. And then I keep this at 1 for just regular hems. And then when I top stitch, I like to bump up my differential, and I sometimes like to bump up my stitch length. But since I am going to be hemming first, I'm going to keep this at 1 and then keep this at 3. And sometimes I'll sew a little bit, look at my stitch, and then see what it looks like before I continue going. So we see here, we can look at my hem that I have pinned down. You can turn it upside down so you can see where your fabric is laying, to be able to have both of your needle threads on that fold. You don't want to have one needle going on one layer of fabric, because it's more likely to have a little bit of tunneling. So I always prefer to have both of my needle stitches going through both layers of fabric. And so I kind of like to gauge here. And so this one, it's a little bit, if I go to the thick black line, it's a little bit too close to the edge. So I'm going to be making sure I'm a little bit, you can see here, a little bit past, I can't see that like that, like here. I'm going to have it a little bit past it, and that way that's where I'm going to gauge it, and I'm going to go the whole time, since you can't see where that is, where your fold of the fabric is, while your fabric is upside down. Not upside down, but inside out. And so put your fabric under the pressure foot. I like to start a little bit before the one of the side seams, and then I'm going to overlap it at the end. And you can go slow as you need to. And remember, we're just going to try to keep this as consistent as possible where it is. That way it'll be as straight as possible. to look here to see. I'm a little bit, quite a bit of overhang, but it's all good. I like to stop, double check my stitch length, make sure that my stitches aren't too close together. But then you also want to give it a nice stretch. Your stitches should stretch about as much as your fabric stretches for the most part. It doesn't have to 100% match, but you want it to stretch more with it than it doesn't, because less chance of popping stitches. So this is actually pretty good for how much it stretches and how much this stretches with it. And when I get to the seam, I like to kind of pull my fabric a little bit to help get it over that hump. There are also hump jumpers. I've never actually used one with this machine or any machine, but I kind of just pull it and it seems to work out, for me at least. And sometimes when you cover stitch, your stitches kind of pull out like that because it didn't start right where you started, which is fine when you're sewing it around in the round. So you can just kind of pull that to loosen those stitches. That way you make sure you overlap over where your stitches are stuck inside of your shirt. And also, if it pulls like this, I like to just lift up my pressure foot just a tad so the fabric kind of goes back under and it's not stretching it too much, and then continue going the rest of the way. So I just did a few stitches. Make sure you pull your hand wheel towards you to lift your needles to the highest position. Lift your pressure foot. Get something to loosen up those threads. So you get I have a screwdriver, put that underneath those needles, hold it so there's a little bit of tension. Then you're going to release them with these little levers up here, are the releasers. And then you just pull this out, clip the thread, and then pull it back into the left and clip it. And sometimes the stitches will stick a little bit. If they do, I just kind of pull them out and then pull it. Sometimes they get twisted and tangled, and so then you want to make sure you tie off your stitches. So I do that by a square knot. If you don't do a square knot, your knot will undo because it's not actually a knot. Now that I'm going to be top stitching my neckband, I like to bump up my differential. I'm going to do it 2 notches, and I'm also going to move my stitch length just 1 little notch. So I have these cute little tags, and so I went ahead and already basted that on, and I'll pull out the basting stitches when I'm done. But I like to top stitch my neckband with my shirt inside out. Makes it a lot easier to have the machine foot inside of the shirt rather than trying to do it this way. It's more kind of a pain with it all on the outside. It's way easier to do it like this. So that's how I like to do it. Since I have a tag, I like to start top stitching right after the tag. That way when I finish, I'll go over the tag and then overlap a little bit. Sometimes when I've tried starting right where the seam line is of my neckband and the tag, sometimes it skips stitches and it gets a little wonky there, so I like to do that at the very end. And so that's what I'm going to do. And then also, since I have my right and middle needle, I like to line up this the little mark, the little hole for the right needle. I like to basically line the outside of that hole with my seam line. I'm going to go ahead and just put this under here, and you want to make sure that your stitches are facing inside towards your bodice. I'm just going to lay this down. So I like to use one hand to kind of slightly push your fabric. That way you don't get any bunching up here at your neckline. So I have one hand that kind of holds that there, and then this hand I kind of make sure I guide that, keep this, my seam line lined up here. That way my stitches are nice and straight. And so again, go slow if you need to, and take your time. You know, sometimes these machines can be a little touchy, and you can go a little bit faster than you're anticipating, but yeah, and then we just go to town. I occasionally will adjust. And again, just like around seams with my regular hem, I'll kind of help pull it just a tad while it's going over that seam. That way it doesn't get stuck. Because if I can, with this particular cover stitch machine, I can never stop on a bulky seam or else it'll mess everything up. So I always have to make sure I go stop before or stop after if I'm ever going to stop sewing. And again, I also like to double check this and see if it's getting wavy at all. If it is, bump that differential up. I bumped mine up already, so I shouldn't have that much of an issue. But also when you wear it, if it has a little bit of wave, just a tad, and you have great recovery for your fabric, it should still lay fine. It's the fabric that doesn't have good recovery that you want to be careful with mainly. Okay, now I'm getting to where that tag is. I want to make sure I don't stop in the tag. And I overlapped it. Turn your hand wheel towards you so your needles are in the highest position. Lift your pressure foot. Put something underneath your needles just to give a little bit of tension. Release it and pull. Snip those threads and then pull it back to the left. So I like, sometimes the stitches get a little tight once you pull it, so I just like to loosen it just a smidge before I tie them off. And again, just make sure you do a square knot. And snip your threads. And I like to just pull out my basting stitches. And you clip the threads on the other side. Nice top stitched neckline, as well as your nice hemmed bottom. Beautiful. And that's it. To stay up to date on the latest videos, be sure to subscribe to my channel, or you can check out my blog at sewingandthings.com.